The wind cut through the contraband camp like a dull knife, shredding the fragile silence of the Tennessee winter. Inside the canvas walls of the makeshift tent, the air hung heavy and damp, smelling of river mud and the stale copper scent of sickness. Eliza lay rigid on her pallet, her eyes tracing the jagged tear in the roof where the starlight bled through. Beside her, Thomas breathed in a shallow, rattling rhythm, his chest hitching with every exhale. His injured leg, wrapped in graying bandages, radiated a feverish heat that she could feel even through the thin wool blanket separating them. The camp outside was never truly quiet. It was a living, suffering beast. Somewhere to the east, a sentry coughed, a dry hacking sound that echoed off the frozen ground. A baby wailed, thin and hopeless, before being shushed into silence. But these were the sounds of the living, the sounds of misery. Eliza wasn't listening for them. She was listening for the sound that came when the misery stopped, the sound of wheels that didn't creak like the supply wagons, but rolled with a well-oiled, predatory silence. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, her fingers brushing the rough fabric, waiting for the rhythm of the road to change. They called them the night doctors. The name was whispered around the cooking fires in the daylight, spoken low so the wind wouldn't carry it back to the white tents of the medical officers. The elders said they were spirits, haints sent by the devil to drag the freedmen back to hell. But Eliza knew better. She had been a healer on the plantation. She knew the smell of medicine and the sharp metallic tang of blood. These weren't spirits. They were men of science with cold hands and empty eyes, men who viewed the thousands of refugees in the camp not as souls to be saved, but as raw material to be harvested. They said the night doctors carried a black bottle, one whiff, and your voice was stolen, your limbs turned to lead, and you woke up on a slab with a lantern shining in your eyes. Thomas shifted in his sleep, a moan escaping his lips as the pain in his crushed leg flared. Eliza placed a soothing hand on his forehead. It was burning. He was weak, and in this place weakness was a beacon. It was exactly what the men in the black coats were hunting for. The fear in her chest tightened like a knot. She wasn't guarding him from the fever, she was guarding him from the cure. Then she heard it. It started as a vibration in the ground, a subtle tremor that traveled up through the dirt floor and into her bones. Clop, squelch, clop, squelch. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, heavy. It wasn't the frantic pace of a dispatch rider or the chaotic rumble of artillery. It was a single wagon, moving with terrifying patience through the sucking mud of the main thoroughfare. Eliza's breath hitched. She rolled onto her side, pressing her ear toward the canvas wall. The ambient noises of the camp, the distant snoring, the rustle of dry leaves, seemed to evaporate, terrified into silence by the approaching wheels. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The horse's hooves struck a patch of stone, a sharp clack that rang out like a gunshot in the dark. Creak, creak. The leather harness strained. It was coming closer, winding through the maze of tents, bypassing the rows where the healthy workers slept. It was heading toward the edge of the camp, toward the quarantine line, toward them. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that she feared was loud enough to be heard outside. She reached out, gripping Thomas's shoulder, ready to shake him awake, ready to run, though she knew he couldn't walk. The wagon stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It wasn't 20 feet away. It was right there, just on the other side of the thin fabric wall. Eliza could hear the wet snort of the horse, the jingle of a metal bit, and the heavy, wet breathing of a man. A shadow fell across the canvas, blocking the moonlight, a long, distorted shape of a man in a tall hat, sitting high on the driver's bench. He didn't climb down. He just sat there, waiting, listening. Was he checking a list? Was he smelling the fever on the air? Eliza clamped her hand over her mouth to stifle a whimper. A match flared outside, the sudden hiss of sulfur startlingly loud. The shadow grew larger as a pipe was lit, the sweet, pungent aroma of tobacco drifting through the gaps in the tent. The driver exhaled, a long, weary sound. Then the reins snapped. Hya! The wheels groaned into motion again, the mud sucking at the rims with a wet, popping sound. The shadow slid away, moving further down the line to the next tent. Eliza didn't exhale until the sound of the wheels faded entirely into the dark, leaving her shivering in the cold, knowing that tonight they had been passed over, but tomorrow the wagon would return. Daylight in the camp did not bring warmth, It only revealed the grey, unending squalor that the darkness had mercifully hidden. The sun was a pale, sickly disk behind a curtain of wood smoke that hung low over the thousands of tents. Eliza stepped out into the mud, the cold air biting at her exposed skin. The ground was a churned slurry of black earth and waste, sucking at her boots with a wet, greedy sound that seemed to mimic the chewing of a mouth. Everywhere there was motion, but it was the frantic, desperate motion of survival. Women hunched over washboards, their hands raw and red. Men chopped green wood that hissed and popped in the fires. Stray dogs fought over scraps of hardtack trodden into the filth. The booming of Union cannons in the distance was a constant rhythm, a heartbeat of war that no one even looked up for anymore. Eliza carried a bundle of soiled rags toward the river, her head down, trying to make herself small. She had left Thomas sleeping, his face pale and slick with sweat, believing that the chaos of the day offered a shield that the silence of the night did not. But as she navigated the maze of canvas and rope, she felt eyes on her. Not the lecherous eyes of soldiers, but the cold, calculating gaze of the camp itself. It felt like a pen where cattle waited for the slaughter, mooing in confusion while the butcher sharpened his knife in the shed. The riverbank was a graveyard of trees, stripped bare for firewood, leaving only jagged stumps that looked like broken teeth jutting from the red clay. This was where old Mo worked. He was a man carved from oak and sorrow, his back permanently bent from decades of digging in the hard Georgia soil before the war brought him here. Today, he wasn't washing. He was digging again, waist deep in a fresh hole near the tree line. Eliza knelt by the freezing water, plunging her hands in to scrub the rags, the shock of the cold stealing her breath. She watched Mo out of the corner of her eye. He wasn't digging a latrine. The hole was 6 feet long. He paused, leaning on his spade, his breath pluming in the air like dragon smoke. He looked at her, his eyes milky with cataracts, but sharp with knowing. "Ground's hard today, Liza," he rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "Hard to open, easy to close. But they don't stay closed, do they?" He spat onto the clay. Eliza froze, the wet fabric dripping in her hands. She knew what he meant. The rumors of empty graves. "Who's taking them, Mo?" she whispered, the sound of the river rushing to drown her words. Mo climbed out of the grave, wiping his muddy hands on his trousers. He shuffled closer, lowering his voice until it was barely audible over the lap of the water. "New doctor," he wheezed. "Dr. Vance. Seen him at the infirmary. Clean boots, too clean." He looked around, checking for the blue uniforms of the Union Patrol. "He don't use the saw like the others, Liza. He uses the bottle, the sweet air, chloroform." Mo's face twisted in disgust. "And he don't want the ones dying of flux or fever. He wants the ones with strong hearts, the ones that break hard." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind shot down Eliza's spine. Thomas. Thomas had survived a falling beam that should have killed a mule. He had a crushed leg, yes, but his heart was a drum of iron. He was exactly what a man looking for stamina would want. "He likes the strong ones," Mo repeated, his gaze drifting back to the empty hole. "Says he needs to see how the machine works while the steam is still in it." Eliza dropped the wet laundry into the mud. She didn't say goodbye. She turned and ran. Her lungs burned as she scrambled back up the slippery bank, her boots skidding on the treacherous ground. The camp, which had seemed merely miserable before, now looked like a trap. Every tent flap seemed to hide a watcher. Every soldier looked like an accomplice. She tore through the crowd, ignoring the shouts of people she bumped into, her eyes fixed on the tattered flag of her own tent in the distance. But even before she reached it, she knew. The flap was thrown wide open, flapping uselessly in the wind. A small crowd of neighbors stood gathered around the entrance, their arms crossed, shaking their heads with that pitying look reserved for the doomed. Eliza burst through them, stumbling into the tent. It was empty, the pallet was cold, the blanket was gone. Mrs. Gable, a woman from the next tent over, reached out and touched Eliza's arm. "Soldiers came," she said softly, "with that tall doctor, said his leg looked gangrenous, said he needed the hospital." She pointed toward the large wooden structure on the hill, the only permanent building in the camp. The infirmary. To everyone else, it was a place of healing. To Eliza, staring at the empty space where her husband had been, it looked like a mouth waiting to swallow. Eliza pushed open the heavy oak door of the infirmary, and the air inside hit her like a physical blow. It didn't smell like the camp outside. It smelled of lye soap, scorched metal, and underneath it all, the sickly sweet rot of gangrene, masked by the sharp sting of vinegar. The noise of the wind was instantly cut off, replaced by a suffocating stillness that was somehow louder. Somewhere deep in the building, water was dripping with a rhythmic, maddening plink, plink, plink into a metal bucket. A low moan drifted down the hallway, vibrating through the floorboards, but it was quickly swallowed by the thick walls. The waiting room was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp that cast long, wavering shadows against the whitewashed timber. Rows of empty benches lined the walls, looking like pews in a church where the god was pain. Eliza's boots squeaked on the scrubbed floor as she stepped forward, her hands balled into fists to stop them from trembling. She wasn't here to beg. She was here to take. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice sounding too loud in the oppressive quiet. "Where is Thomas?" A figure detached itself from the shadows in the corner. It was a mountain of a man, wearing an apron stained with old brown splashes that looked like dried rust. This was Cyrus. He didn't speak. He just shuffled forward, his heavy boots dragging on the wood. He was a wall of flesh, his face a blank slab of indifference, eyes dull and heavy-lidded. He raised a hand the size of a shovel, palm out, blocking her path to the double doors that led to the wards. He grunted, a wet, guttural sound deep in his throat, and pointed to the bench. "Sit." Eliza stood her ground, looking up at him. "I am not sitting. My husband was brought here. Thomas, with the leg." Cyrus didn't blink. He just took another step forward, his bulk forcing her back. The air around him smelled of raw meat and stale tobacco. He was the gatekeeper, and he had no interest in keys, only in keeping the gate closed. Eliza opened her mouth to scream, to tear down the building if she had to, but a voice cut through the tension, smooth, cultured, and terrifyingly soft. "Cyrus, that will do." Dr. Silas Vance emerged from the double doors, wiping his hands on a pristine white towel. He was a stark contrast to the filth of the camp. His uniform was tailored, his hair combed with precision, his face pale and clean-shaven. He looked like a porcelain doll placed in a slaughterhouse. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. They remained cold, analytical, like a hawk studying a field mouse. "You must be the wife," he said, his voice a low, hypnotic purr that seemed to wrap around Eliza's mind. "Thomas is resting. The infection was deep, deeper than we thought. He required a sedative." He stepped closer, tossing the towel onto a side table. "You cannot see him now. The trauma of the procedure. He needs absolute quiet. You understand, don't you? We are doing everything science allows." Eliza wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe in the safety of the uniform. But then she looked down. Vance's trousers were creased and spotless, but his boots, his fine black leather boots, were caked at the heels, not with the black sucking mud of the camp, but with heavy red clay. The same red clay from the riverbank where old Mo dug the graves, the same clay found only 6 feet down. Eliza walked out the front door, her back stiff, feeling Dr. Vance's gaze boring into her shoulder blades until the heavy wood clicked shut. But she didn't go back to the tent. She couldn't. The moment she reached the edge of the torchlight, she veered off the path, slipping into the shadows between the supply sheds. The camp was settling into a fitful sleep, the noises of the day replaced by the rustle of rats and the wind snapping the canvas. Eliza circled the infirmary, moving like a ghost. She found a spot near the rear entrance, wedged behind a stack of rotting crates and a mound of discarded hay. The cold seeped up through the ground, numbing her toes and turning her fingers into claws. But she didn't move. She barely breathed. The back of the hospital was different. There were no lanterns here, no whitewashed walls, just raw timber and a wide double door that looked like the maw of a barn. Above her, a single window glowed with a sickly yellow light. Occasionally a shadow would pass across the glass, elongated, distorted, pacing back and forth. It was the doctor, and he wasn't resting. He was waiting. Time lost its shape in the dark. It might have been an hour or 3 before the sound returned. The vibration came first, trembling through the crate Eliza leaned against. Clop, squelch, clop, The wagon. It didn't come up the main road this time. It took the service trail, the wheels muffled by the thick layer of wet straw scattered on the path. A cloud drifted past the moon, and in the sudden gloom, the vehicle materialized. It was a hearse wagon, painted a black so deep it seemed to drink the light. The driver was the same hunched figure from the night before, his hat pulled low. He pulled the reins, bringing the horse to a halt right in front of the double doors. The horse didn't whinny. It stood head down, defeated. The driver didn't get down. He simply knocked on the wagon's side panel. 3 sharp raps. Thud, thud, thud. A signal. The rear doors of the infirmary groaned open. The sound was like a bone snapping in a quiet room. Cyrus filled the doorway. Backlit by the dim light of the hallway, he looked monstrous, his shadow stretching out to swallow the wagon. He wasn't empty-handed. He was carrying something wrapped in a coarse grey blanket, slung over his shoulder as easily as a sack of flour. He stepped down into the mud, his boots sinking deep under the added weight. Eliza leaned forward, squinting through the slats of the crate, her heart hammering against her ribs. As Cyrus heaved the burden into the back of the wagon, the blanket slipped. It fell away to reveal the face of a young man. Eliza clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. It was the boy from the water pump, a lad of no more than 18, strong and healthy just hours ago. But it wasn't his face that froze her blood. It was his eyes. They were wide open. They were staring up at the night sky, catching the moonlight. He wasn't dead. His chest gave a tiny, jerky heave. He was blinking rapidly, frantically. He was awake, fully awake, but his body was as limp as a wet rope. The driver chuckled, a dry, rasping sound like dead leaves skittering on pavement. "Fresh one?" he asked, his voice low. Cyrus just grunted and shoved the boy's legs inside, slamming the tailgate shut. The boy didn't scream. He couldn't. He was trapped in his own flesh, a prisoner in a body that wouldn't obey. This wasn't a hospital collecting the dead. It was a market for the living. The driver snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, carrying the paralyzed boy into the darkness. Cyrus stood there for a moment, watching it go, before turning back to the infirmary. He didn't close the doors immediately. He left them cracked open, just a sliver of light that cut across the mud. An invitation, or a mistake. Eliza knew she had a choice. She could run back to her tent and pray the wagon never came for her. Or she could go through that door, down into the belly of the beast, and find Thomas before he became the next sack in the back of the wagon. She stood up, shaking the hay from her dress. She wasn't running. Eliza knew she couldn't fight Cyrus. He was a mountain of gristle and silence. She was made of exhaustion and fear. She needed chaos. She needed the one thing a camp of canvas and timber feared more than the plague. She crept toward the supply shed adjacent to the infirmary, her hands trembling as she gathered a fistful of dry, brittle straw from the frozen mud. She struck a match against the rough wood of the shed wall. The sound was a sharp scritch, followed by the sudden, aggressive hiss of the flame. She dropped the burning match into the straw and backed away. At first, it was just a glow, a breathing orange heart in the dark. Then the wind caught it. The fire roared to life with a sound like a tearing sheet, snapping and popping as it chewed into the dry wood. "Fire!" she screamed, pitching her voice low and desperate. "Fire at the stables!" The door to the infirmary banged open. Cyrus lumbered out, his heavy boots thundering on the porch, shouting something incoherent as he ran toward the smoke. The path was clear. Eliza didn't hesitate. She slipped through the open door, leaving the noise of the growing panic behind her, and stepped into the silence of the enemy's house. Inside, the air was thick enough to taste. It was a suffocating cocktail of chloroform, stale pipe smoke, and the metallic tang of dried blood. The heat was oppressive, radiating from a pot-bellied stove that ticked and groaned in the corner. Eliza moved past the empty beds of the main ward, her footsteps swallowed by the floor runners. She found the door she was looking for, a narrow, unobtrusive panel at the end of the hall that didn't lead to an office but down. A set of wooden stairs descended into the earth, dark and steep like a throat. As she crept down, the sounds of the camp above, the shouting, the crackle of the fire, faded away, replaced by a low, humming silence. At the bottom, a gas lamp hissed, casting a sickly green light over the room. This was no cellar. It was a museum of horrors. Shelves lined the stone walls, filled with glass jars where pale, suspended shapes floated in amber liquid. Anatomy charts hung like tapestries, depicting muscles flayed from bone. In the center of the room, dominating the space, was a heavy wooden table equipped with thick leather straps, and on the table lay Thomas. He was stripped to the waist, his dark skin gleaming with sweat under the gaslight. His chest rose and fell in a slow, unnatural rhythm, his head lolling to the side, eyes rolled back to show the whites. He was deep in the black bottle's sleep. Eliza rushed to his side, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch, afraid to break him. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thomas, wake up." He didn't stir. Then she saw it. Across his broad chest, drawn with precise, jagged strokes of black charcoal, were lines. Dotted lines tracing the curve of his ribs, circles marking the position of his heart, X's over his major arteries. They weren't medical notes for healing. They were a map for excavation. Dr. Vance wasn't trying to save Thomas's leg. He was preparing to open his chest. He was going to see how long a strong man's heart could beat while he watched. A wave of nausea rolled over Eliza, but she choked it down. She grabbed Thomas's shoulder and shook him hard. "Wake up!" she hissed. "You have to wake up!" His eyelids fluttered, a low groan vibrating in his chest. But before his eyes could focus, the floorboards above creaked. Heavy footsteps. The distraction was over. They were coming back. The wooden stairs groaned under the weight of two men, a sound that vibrated through the stone floor and into the soles of Eliza's boots. She backed against the cold, damp wall, her hand searching the prep table behind her until her fingers curled around the neck of a heavy amber bottle. The door at the bottom of the stairs swung open, and Dr. Vance stepped into the circle of gaslight, Cyrus looming like a thunderhead behind him. Vance didn't look frantic from the fire outside. He looked annoyed, like a man whose reading had been interrupted by a noisy neighbor. He spotted Eliza instantly. He didn't shout. He didn't call for the guards. He simply sighed, a puff of white breath in the cold room, and adjusted his cuffs. "I'm disappointed, Eliza," he said, his voice echoing off the shelves of specimens. "I offered you the comfort of ignorance. Most people would kill for that." He walked toward the table, picking up a scalpel. The light caught the blade, a sharp silver glint that seemed to slice the air itself. "Now," he continued, tapping the flat of the blade against his palm. "Tap, tap, tap. You become a variable I have to remove." Cyrus cracked his knuckles, the sound like dry wood snapping, and stepped forward to finish what the doctor's words had started. Eliza didn't look at the knife. She looked at the label on the bottle in her hand. Ether. She ripped the cork out with her teeth, the sudden, sickly sweet chemical stench flooding the small room, stinging her eyes and burning her throat like acid. It was the smell of oblivion. As Cyrus reached for her, his massive hands aiming for her neck to crush the scream out of her, she didn't retreat. She lunged. She splashed the volatile liquid directly into his face, into his open, grunting mouth and wide, dull eyes. Cyrus roared, a sound that instantly turned into a wet, choking gurgle as the concentrated fumes hit his lungs. He stumbled back, pawing at his face, blindly crashing into a shelf of jars. Crash, tink, splash. Glass shattered, sending preserved organs sliding across the floor in a gruesome slurry. The giant swayed, his knees buckling under the weight of the sudden chemical twilight, forcing his brain to shut down. He hit the floor with a tremor that shook the table out cold. Dr. Vance stood still, the scalpel frozen in midair. The amusement was gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian stillness. "Primitive," he sneered, stepping over Cyrus's body without looking down. "You think you can stop the future with a splash of solvent? I am the mind here, Eliza. You are just the meat." He raised the blade, aiming for her throat, but he had forgotten the variable on the table. Thomas's eyes snapped open, not with clarity, but with the primal, adrenaline-fueled rage of a trapped animal. He couldn't walk, but his arms were free. As Vance lunged, Thomas swung his heavy, calloused fist in a wide arc. It wasn't a precision strike. It was a hammer blow. His knuckles connected with the side of Vance's head with a sickening thud. The doctor didn't scream. He just folded, his eyes rolling back as he crumpled to the stone floor next to his henchman. The scalpel clattered away, spinning on the stone with a metallic hiss. Silence rushed back into the room, broken only by Thomas's ragged, gasping breath. "Eliza!" he rasped, the word tearing out of his throat. "Get me! Out!" The ascent from the basement was a torture of inches. Eliza became a living crutch, her shoulder wedged tight under Thomas's armpit, bearing the weight of a man built for heavy labor who was now reduced to a stumbling ghost. Every step up the narrow wooden staircase drew a sharp, hissed breath through his clenched teeth. His injured leg dragged behind him, a dead weight that struck the risers with a dull, rhythmic thud. Thump, step, drag. Thump, step, drag. They burst out of the infirmary's side door and into the biting cold, the sweat on their skin instantly turning to ice. The fire at the stables had died down to a smouldering heap of orange embers, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping hands reaching out from the earth. The chaos of the camp had settled into a confused, wary murmur, leaving the path to the river dangerously exposed. They moved into the deep darkness between the rows of tents, their progress agonizingly slow. The mud was no longer just dirt. It was an enemy, thick and adhesive, grabbing at their ankles with every step, trying to hold them in place for the butcher. "Keep moving," Eliza whispered, her voice trembling with exertion, though her own lungs were burning like they were filled with smoke. "Just to the water, just to the water." They were halfway to the tree line, the smell of the river damp in their noses, when the sound returned. It wasn't the shout of soldiers or the baying of hounds. It was the rhythm. Clop, squelch, clop, the night wagon. It hadn't left. It was prowling. The sound drifted from the main road, cutting through the river fog like a knife. Dr. Vance might be unconscious on the basement floor, but the machine he controlled was still running. The driver, the faceless shadow in the tall hat, was still out there, completing his rounds. Eliza felt Thomas stiffen against her. The sound triggered a primal surge of adrenaline in him, overriding the pain. They scrambled over the rough ground, sliding down the steep embankment toward the black, churning water. Behind them, the wagon wheels grew louder, the tempo shifting. It wasn't the slow crawl of a patrol anymore. The creak groan of the axles accelerated. The horses' hooves struck the ground with heavy, punishing force. The driver knew. Somehow, the driver knew the schedule had been broken. The hunter had caught the scent, and it was thundering toward the riverbank to cut them off. The riverbank was a nightmare of tangled roots and slick, freezing mud that smelled of ancient decay. Eliza and Thomas slid down the final few feet, crashing into the shallow water with a splash that sounded deafening in the quiet night. The cold was instantaneous, 1,000 needles piercing their skin, shocking the breath from their lungs. But there was no time to shiver. Eliza clawed at the brush, her hands numb and clumsy, searching for the rough hemp rope old Mo had promised would be there. She found it, a frayed lifeline tethering a small, flat-bottomed skiff to a cypress knee. "Get in," she gasped, shoving Thomas toward the gunwale. He tumbled over the side, landing in the bottom of the boat with a heavy wooden thud that rocked the small craft violently. Eliza didn't climb in gracefully. She threw herself over the stern, kicking off the bank with the last of her strength. The wood scraped against the gravel. Grrrsh! A sound like a tombstone dragging before the river caught them. The black, oily water swirled around the hull, lifting them, pulling them away from the shore and into the embrace of the current. Above them, on the ridge of the bank, the wagon wheels ground to a halt. The silence that followed was absolute. Eliza grabbed the oars, but she didn't row. She froze, staring up at the silhouette looming against the night sky. The driver of the night wagon stood at the edge of the drop, a towering shadow in a long coat. He struck a match. The flare illuminated the brass lantern in his hand, and as the flame caught, he held it high. The yellow beam cut through the river mist, sweeping over the water like a searchlight. It passed over a floating log, a patch of reeds, and then it found them. The light blinded Eliza for a second, exposing them completely. She braced herself for the gunshot, for the shout, for the splash of men diving in to drag them back. But the shot never came. The figure didn't move. He didn't raise a weapon. He simply stood there, a silent sentinel holding a light for the damned. The current spun the boat slowly, drifting them further into the grey wall of fog rising from the deep channel. The light on the bank grew smaller, shrinking to a single, baleful eye watching them vanish. The driver wasn't chasing them because he didn't have to. The camp was full of other souls, other bodies to be harvested. Eliza realized with a sickening jolt that to the night doctors, they weren't enemies to be hunted. They were just inventory that had been lost. The wagon would turn around. It would go back to the tents. It would find someone else. As the boat slipped into the true darkness of the river, the sound of the wagon wheels started up again. Clop. Squelch. Clop. Fading back toward the camp, back toward the living, leaving Eliza and Thomas alone in the silence of the water. The fire in our hearth burns clean tonight. It crackles with dry oak, snapping pleasantly in the silence of our small cabin, a sound that is miles and years away from the wet, hissing fires of the contraband camp. Outside, the rain taps against the glass, a gentle, rhythmic drumming that helps the crops grow, not the cold deluge that turned the world to mud. Thomas sits in the rocking chair across from me, the wood creaking softly as he sways back and forth. Kriak, kriak. He is an old man now. The grey in his hair matches the wool of his sweater. He is safe. We are free. But on nights like this, when the wind howls around the eaves just so, he rubs his chest. He does it unconsciously, his hand drifting up to the spot over his heart, tracing invisible lines through the fabric of his shirt. He tells the grandchildren it's just an old ache from the damp weather. But I know better. I know what lies beneath the cloth. I still remember the first time we bathed him, weeks after we reached the safety of the Union lines in Ohio. The charcoal marks Dr. Vance had drawn on his skin, the dotted lines for the incision, the X over his heart. They didn't wash off. The coal dust had mixed with the sweat and the fear, settling deep into the pores, staining him like a tattoo. Over time, the black faded to a bruised grey, but the pattern remained. It is a map of a death that didn't happen, a blueprint of a dissection that was interrupted. Every time I see him shirtless in the dim light of the bedroom, I see the ghost of that scalpel. I see the cold calculation of a man who looked at my husband and saw only machinery to be taken apart. The scar isn't raised flesh, it is a shadow, a permanent reminder that to some we were never people. We were just specimens waiting for the jar.